It was Christmas Eve. I was 63 years old, sitting right next to the twinkling lights of the tree I had helped my daughter decorate just 2 days before. That was the moment my son-in-law, Jason, slid a crisp white envelope across the dinner table. He looked me right in the eye, in front of my grandchildren, and told me my free ride was over. Inside that envelope was a rental agreement. The amount listed was $1,950 a month. My hands did not shake. I had learned over the last 18 months to keep my hands very still, but inside, something that had been quietly fraying finally snapped. To understand that night, you need to understand what I gave up to get there. I sold my house on Maple Drive. I handed over $215,000 of my life savings, only to be treated like a stranger in a house I helped buy. Before I tell you how my attorney handled that dinner table ambush, please take a moment to leave a comment and let me know which city or state you are joining us from today. I truly enjoy seeing where our community gathers. Note: while this story is a narrative created for clarity and impact, the message and the financial lessons it carries are absolutely real, and they are vital for protecting everything you have worked for. My name is Eleanor. Before I tell you about that cold Christmas Eve, I want you to know who I was before everything changed, and what I truly walked away from. For 31 years, I taught 4th grade in a small, quiet school district just outside of Columbus, Ohio. Teaching was not just a job to me. It was my life. I spent 3 decades grading papers at my kitchen table, watching children grow up, and saving every penny I could. I was never a wealthy woman, but I was a careful one. My husband, Thomas, and I built a life based on stability. We bought a modest colonial house on Maple Drive, and we made it our mission to own it outright. When Thomas passed away 8 years ago, it was sudden. A heart attack that gave us no warning at all. One minute we were planning our retirement, and the next, I was a widow. He left me with a heavy grief. A grief so thick, it took me 2 full years just to remember how to sleep through the night. But he also left me with a gift. He left me with a paid-off house. Maple Drive was my sanctuary. It was not a mansion, but it was mine. Every square inch of that property represented 34 years of marriage, hard work, and shared dreams. I knew every creak of those floorboards. I knew exactly which window would rattle when the wind blew from the north. I had planted rose bushes along the back fence, and I spent my summer mornings tending to them with a cup of coffee in my hand. I was independent. I had my modest teacher's pension, my social security, and a small savings account. I had my neighbor Martha, who lived 3 houses down. We had a system. When I had my knee surgery, Martha brought me homemade chicken soup every single day. When she visited her sister in Florida, I was the one who made sure her cat was fed and her mail was brought inside. I was 61 years old, and I was proud of the life I had maintained on my own. I was not looking for a handout. I was not looking for someone to take care of me. I was a woman who had earned her rest, and my home on Maple Drive was the foundation of that rest. It was my equity. It was my security. It was my history. But as the years passed, the silence in that big house started to feel a little louder. My son had moved across the ocean to London for work, and my daughter, Sarah, lived 4 hours away in Cincinnati. Sarah was my anchor during those first few years after Thomas died. She would drive down every other weekend to sit with me while I sorted through her father's old flannels and books. She held my hand at the estate attorney's office. She was the one who showed up, or at least, that is what I believed at the time. I want you to remember that, because it matters. I was a woman with a home, a career, and a plan, until I was convinced to let it all go for the sake of family. It was a beautiful Sunday afternoon in late April when my daughter, Sarah, and her husband, Jason, drove down from Cincinnati to visit me. At that time, I was still living on Maple Drive. The air was thick with the scent of my blooming lilacs, and I had prepared a pot of roast beef, just the way Sarah liked it. I remember looking at her across the kitchen table and thinking how much she looked like her father when she laughed. But that day, her laughter felt a bit forced. She was nervous. I could see it in the way she kept glancing at Jason waiting for him to take the lead. Jason was a man who knew how to occupy a room. He didn't just enter a space, he claimed it. He worked in property management, and he never missed an opportunity to remind you of his expertise. He was charming in that loud, confident way that many people find impressive. He spoke with a rhythmic authority, his voice deep and steady, the kind of voice that made you feel like he had already figured out all the problems in the world. He started talking about the real estate market in Cincinnati. He used words like equity, appreciation, and leverage. Words that I knew, but he put them together in a way that felt like a secret language only he truly understood. "Eleanor," he said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on my lace tablecloth. "Sarah and I have been talking. We've found a house. A real house. Not just a starter home, but a 4-bedroom colonial with a finished basement and a beautiful yard for the kids." Sarah reached over and squeezed my hand. Her eyes were bright, almost pleading. "Mom," she said, "the best part isn't the house itself. It's the attached suite. It's a full mother-in-law suite. It has its own private entrance off the side garden. It has its own little kitchen, a large bedroom, and a living area that gets the morning sun. We were thinking, if we could make this work, maybe you would want to sell this place and come live with us permanently." I was quiet for a long moment. I looked out the window at my backyard. I thought about the 34 years I had spent on Maple Drive. I thought about the rose bushes I had planted with Thomas. I thought about the quiet comfort of knowing every creak in the floor. But then, I thought about the long, lonely winters. I thought about the 4-hour drive it took to see my grandchildren, Emma and Noah. I thought about how much I missed hearing the sound of family in the morning. Jason sensed my hesitation. He was good at that. He shifted his tone to something more professional, more reasonable. He explained that it was a win-win situation. He told me that instead of living alone in a house that was getting harder to maintain, I could be part of a multi-generational home. He told me I wouldn't be dependent on them. I would have my own front door. I would have my own space, but I would be right there if anything ever happened. "Think about it, Eleanor," Jason said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "You'd be the heart of the home. The kids would grow up with their grandmother right downstairs, and financially, it just makes sense. Why leave your money sitting in a house that's 30 years old when you could put it into a brand new property that will grow in value for the whole family?" He made it sound so logical. He made it sound like I would be doing them a favor as much as they were doing one for me. Sarah kept talking about how much she missed me. She talked about how Emma was always asking when Grandma was coming to visit. She painted a picture of Sunday dinners and helped with the school run. It was a picture of a life I realized I desperately wanted. I was 61 years old, and I was tired of being an island. I want you to understand the weight of that moment. I wasn't being forced. I was being invited into a dream. Jason described the colonial house with such detail that I could almost see myself standing in that sunlit kitchen. He talked about the lenders he knew, the paperwork he could handle, and how he would make sure everything was all taken care of. That was a phrase he used often. All taken care of. It was meant to make me feel safe. It was meant to make me feel like I didn't have to worry about the details because a professional was on the job. I sat there, listening to the sounds of my quiet house, and for the first time, the silence felt heavy. I looked at my daughter, my only daughter, who was smiling at me with so much hope. I looked at Jason, who seemed so capable and sure of himself. I didn't see a predator. I didn't see a man looking for a payday. I saw a son-in-law who wanted to take care of his family. "Okay," I said softly. "Let's do it. Let's sell Maple Drive." Jason clapped his hands together and smiled a wide, triumphant smile. Sarah jumped up and hugged me so hard I could barely breathe. In that moment, I felt a sense of relief. I felt like the next chapter of my life was going to be the best one yet. I didn't know that I had just stepped into a carefully crafted trap. I didn't know that the sweetness of the proposal was just a layer of sugar over a very bitter reality. I was walking toward a future that felt like a warm embrace, but it was actually the beginning of a long, cold winter. Selling a home is an emotional process. But selling the home where you raised your children and buried your husband, that is something else entirely. The month of May was a blur of cardboard boxes and bubble wrap. Every item I picked up carried a memory. A chipped coffee mug from a vacation in Maine. A height chart marked on the pantry door in Thomas's handwriting. I spent hours sitting on the floor of the living room, sorting through 31 years of life. Maple Drive sold quickly. It was a well-maintained house in a good neighborhood, and it sold for $255,000. It was a solid amount of money. It was everything Thomas and I had worked for. After the closing costs and the small amount I set aside in a separate savings account for emergencies, I had exactly $215,000. That was my life's work. That was my security. Jason was incredibly helpful during this time. He drove down to help me move the heavier furniture. He brought coffee and donuts, and kept telling me how excited the kids were. He handled all the communication with the real estate agents in Cincinnati. He told me that since he worked in property management, he knew exactly how to structure the deal to get the best interest rates. The financing on these big colonials can be tricky, Eleanor, he told me one evening while we were packing up the last of the china. But don't you worry. I'm going to make sure your name is right there on the deed alongside mine and Sarah's. You're an owner, not a tenant. This is your house too. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? This was my daughter's husband. He was the father of my grandchildren. We were becoming a single unit. We were becoming a family that looked out for one another. The day of the closing arrived in September. We met at a title company office in Cincinnati. The room was cold, filled with the smell of stale coffee and new carpet. There were stacks of paper on the table, hundreds of pages dense with legal language, fine print and numbers. I felt a bit overwhelmed. I had bought a house before, but it had been decades. Things were different now. Jason was in his element. He was chatting with the closing agent, laughing and sharing stories about the property market. He seemed to know everyone in the building. When it was time to sign, he pulled several pages toward me. "Okay, Eleanor," he said, his voice calm and professional. "This part here is the wire transfer confirmation for your $215,000. This page over here is the mortgage disclosure. And these documents here, these are the ownership interest forms. I've already walked the agent through everything. You just need to sign where I've highlighted." I looked at the pages. The words seemed to swim in front of my eyes. Terms like tenancy in common, joint rights of survivorship, and irrevocable gift letter were scattered throughout the text. I started to read through a section on the third page, but Jason gently tapped the paper. "It's just standard boilerplate, Eleanor," he said with a reassuring smile. "It basically says that your contribution is being used for the down payment and that you have a permanent right to reside in the suite. We've already discussed all of this. If we stop to read every single word of this legalese, we'll be here until Christmas." I looked over at Sarah. She was holding Noah in her lap, and she was smiling at me. She looked so happy. She looked so relieved to finally be at the finish line. I didn't want to be the difficult mother-in-law. I didn't want to slow down the process or show that I didn't trust Jason. I wanted this to work. I wanted to be part of this family. So, I picked up the pen. I signed the wire transfer. I signed the disclosure forms. I signed the pages Jason pointed to. I handed over $215,000, my entire safety net, based on a verbal promise and a smile. I should have taken those papers to my own attorney. I know that now. I should have insisted on having a third party review everything before I touched that pen. But when you are 61 years old, and you are looking for a place to belong, you are vulnerable. You want to believe that the people you love will protect you. You want to believe that family is a bond that transcends contracts and fine print. As we walked out of that office and into the bright September sun, Jason put his arm around my shoulder. "Welcome home, Eleanor," he said. "You've made a great investment today, for yourself and for your grandkids." I felt a sense of pride. I felt like I had done something noble. I had helped my daughter get her dream home, and I had secured my place within it. I didn't realize that in that cold office, I had just signed away my independence. I didn't realize that Jason had directed me to sign an irrevocable gift letter. In the eyes of the bank, and in the eyes of the law, my $215,000 was no longer my money. It was a gift, a total, unconditional gift to Jason and Sarah. I had no ownership. I had no equity. I had no legal right to the roof over my head. I had traded a paid-off home on Maple Drive for a signature on a piece of paper that gave me nothing in return. It was the most expensive decision I had ever made, and the most dangerous. But that day, as I drove toward the new house with Sarah and the kids, I felt like I was finally going home. I was 61 years old, and I was stepping into a future that was built on a foundation of sand. The first 8 months in Cincinnati felt like a beautiful, long-awaited dream. I moved into the suite in September, just as the leaves were beginning to turn into those brilliant oranges and deep reds that make the Midwest feel so much like home. The suite was everything Sarah had promised. It was bright. It was quiet. It had its own entrance off the side garden, where I spent my first few weeks planting winter pansies and arranging my patio furniture. I took my time decorating. I wanted it to feel like mine, but I also wanted to let go of the clutter of the past. I hung the watercolor painting of Lake Erie that used to hang in our bedroom on Maple Drive. I bought a new, thick quilt for the bed, something soft and warm for the Cincinnati winters. I remember standing in the middle of my small kitchen, smelling the scent of fresh coffee and hearing the distant, muffled sound of Emma and Noah playing in the yard. It felt right. It felt like I had made the correct choice. I felt useful again. That was the most important thing. As a retired teacher, I didn't know how to sit still. I started helping with the school pickups twice a week. I would wait in the car line, watching for 7-year-old Emma and 4-year-old Noah to come running out with their backpacks bouncing. We would go for ice cream, or we would sit at my little kitchen table and work on their letters and numbers. On Saturday mornings, while Sarah and Jason slept in, the children would sneak down to my suite. I would make them silver-dollar pancakes, the tiny ones they loved. And we would read stories until the house upstairs finally started to wake up. I felt close to my daughter again. Sarah and I started a tradition of having dinner together every Thursday evening. Just the two of us. We would talk about her work, about the kids, and about the memories of her father. It was the kind of connection I had been longing for during those lonely years on Maple Drive. But then, the honeymoon phase began to fade. It started with small things. Very small things. Jason had a way of making comments that didn't feel like insults at first, but they stayed with you. They felt like tiny splinters under the skin. He started mentioning the utilities. One evening, as I was walking through the mudroom to drop off some laundry, he stopped me. He didn't raise his voice. He used that same reasonable voice he had used at the closing. "Eleanor," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "I noticed the heat in the suite was set to 72 today. With the price of natural gas going up this winter, we really need to keep the whole house at 68. It's about being fair to the household budget, you know." I felt a flush of embarrassment. I apologized and told him I would turn it down. But as I walked back to my room, I thought about the $215,000 I had put into the house. I thought about the fact that I didn't have a mortgage payment. I felt like I was a partner in this home. But Jason was speaking to me like I was a guest who was being a bit too demanding. Then it was the laundry room. We shared a high-end washer and dryer in the mudroom. One afternoon, I left a basket of clean towels on top of the dryer because the phone had rung. 10 minutes later, Jason knocked on my interior door. He wasn't smiling. "We really need to keep the shared spaces tidy, Eleanor," he said. "Sarah and I have a very specific routine for the kids' clothes. If the laundry room is cluttered, it throws off the whole system." Again. I apologized. Again. I felt that small, sharp splinter. It wasn't just about the towels. It was about the way he stood in the doorway. He didn't step back to let me out. He stood right in the center of the frame, forcing me to wait for him to move. It was a subtle display of power. It was his way of saying, "This is my house. You are just living in it." I tried to tell myself I was being too sensitive. I told myself that living with others requires adjustment. I told myself that I was 63 years old, and perhaps I was just set in my ways. But the cracks were there. They were small, almost invisible. But they were deep. The sunny days were still there, but the shadows were growing longer. I didn't know it yet. But the man who had welcomed me home with open arms was slowly, carefully, beginning to close the door. The atmosphere in the house changed in February. It was a cold, grey month, the kind of weather that keeps everyone trapped indoors. That was when the restless, coiled energy began to radiate from the main part of the house. Sarah came to see me one Thursday afternoon. She didn't stay for dinner. She just sat on the edge of my sofa, looking exhausted. "Jason lost his job, Mom," she whispered. She looked at the door like she was afraid he was listening. "The property management firm. They had a major downsizing. They let 11 people go, including Jason. He's already networking. He says it will only be a few weeks before he finds something better. But he's very stressed." My heart went out to them. I offered to help with the grocery bills or the kids' activities. Sarah thanked me, but she looked like she wanted to cry. From that day on, everything shifted. Jason was home all day, every day. But he wasn't networking. I would hear him pacing upstairs. I would hear his voice rising in anger over small things. A toy left on the stairs. A dish left in the sink. The man who had been so charming and confident was gone. In his place was someone sharp and bitter. The most painful change was the silence. The family dinners that used to include me. The easy, informal ones where I would just wander in from the suite. They stopped. I would be sitting in my living room, reading a book, and I would hear the sounds of laughter and the clinking of silverware through the walls. I would hear Jason telling a story and the kids giggling. And I would realize I hadn't been invited. I told myself it was normal. I told myself they needed space to deal with the job loss. I told myself I was being a burden by expecting to be included. But it hurt. It felt like I was being erased from the family I had given everything to join. I began to notice that Jason was managing my access to the rest of the house. If I knocked on the interior door to ask a question, he would answer it. But he would stay in the mudroom. He wouldn't invite me into the kitchen. He would give me short, one-word answers and then close the door. One afternoon in early spring, I saw the children playing in the backyard. I opened my patio door to go out and join them. I had a bag of sidewalk chalk in my hand. But before I could reach them, Jason appeared on the back deck. "The kids have a lot of homework to finish, Eleanor," he called out. His voice was perfectly calm, but his eyes were cold. "We're trying to keep them focused right now. Maybe another time." Emma looked up at me, her face confused. She started to say something, but Jason put a hand on her shoulder and steered her back toward the house. I stood on my patio, alone, holding a bag of chalk. I felt like an intruder on my own property. I felt like a stranger in a place I had paid $215,000 to call home. By the time the weather turned warm, the isolation was almost complete. Sarah was working longer hours to make up for the lost income. She looked thinner. There were dark circles under her eyes. When we did speak, she chose her words so carefully, as if she were walking on eggshells. She wouldn't look me in the eye when I asked how Jason's job search was going. "He's working on some big leads, Mom," she would say. "He just needs time." But I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in the way the house felt. Heavy and suffocating. I was being kept away from my grandchildren. I was being kept away from my daughter. And I was being kept away from the truth. I sat in my suite that spring, looking at the Lake Erie painting. I remembered the independence I had on Maple Drive. I remembered the rose bushes. I remembered the feeling of being the master of my own life. Now, I was 63 years old, and I was waiting for permission to step into my own kitchen. I was waiting for permission to hug my grandkids. The darkness hadn't just touched the walls. It had moved inside them. I began to realize that I wasn't a partner. I wasn't the heart of the home. I was a financial resource that had been used. And now that the money was gone, I was an inconvenience. What I didn't know. What I couldn't have possibly imagined. was how far Jason was willing to go to make that inconvenience disappear. The gift I had given them was about to become a weapon used against me. The month of July in Cincinnati is often heavy with heat and the constant rhythmic buzzing of cicadas in the old oak trees. I remember one particular Tuesday afternoon. It was a day that felt ordinary until it wasn't. My granddaughter, Emma, who was 7 years old at the time, had managed to sneak away from the main house to visit me. She knocked on my patio door, with that secret, soft rhythm she only used for her grandma. We were sitting on my small patio, side by side in the shade of the garden umbrella. We were sharing a cherry popsicle, the kind that leaves your tongue bright red. Emma was swinging her legs off the edge of the chair, the way 7-year-olds do when they have too much energy to sit still. Her little feet were dusty from playing in the grass. Out of nowhere, in that direct and guileless way that only children speak, she looked up at me and asked a question that stopped my heart. "Grammy," she said, her voice small and curious, "how come you never come inside for dinner anymore? Daddy said you like eating alone because you don't like the noise we make." I felt as if the air had been kicked out of my lungs. I kept my face very still. I had learned over the last few months that my face had to be a mask. I didn't want Emma to see the pain that was suddenly radiating through my chest. "Daddy said you like eating alone." The words repeated in my head, over and over again. I looked at my sweet granddaughter, with her red-stained smile and her innocent eyes, and I realized the depth of the deception. It wasn't just that I wasn't being invited. It was that Jason was actively telling my family that I chose to be isolated. He was painting a picture of me as a grumpy, distant old woman who couldn't stand the sound of her own grandchildren. I took a slow breath and forced myself to smile. I reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Oh, sweetie," I said, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. "Grammy just likes her quiet evenings sometimes. You know how it is. After a long day, I just like to sit and watch the birds." It was a lie. It was a gentle, meaningless lie to protect her from the truth. But it felt like ash in my mouth. Emma seemed satisfied with the answer. She went back to her popsicle, talking about a butterfly she had seen earlier. But inside, something was breaking. After Emma went back into the main house, I sat on that patio for a long time. I watched the sun go down, casting long, skeletal shadows across the yard. I thought about the $215,000. I thought about the gift I had given them. I thought about the way Jason looked at me now, if he looked at me at all. I began to pay closer attention after that day. I noticed the subtle ways I was being managed. When I did go into the mudroom to do laundry, I would hear Jason's voice through the kitchen door. If he heard me, he would stop talking. He would wait for me to finish and go back to my suite before he resumed his conversation with Sarah. I realized that my daughter, Sarah, was also changing. When we did speak, she seemed to be reciting a script. She wouldn't look me in the eye. She would talk about how busy the kids were, or how tired she was from work. She never mentioned dinner. She never mentioned why the interior door was now locked from the other side more often than not. I was being erased. I was 63 years old, and I was being made into a ghost in a house I had helped build. I was being told, without words, that I no longer belonged. I was a tenant without a contract. I was a guest who had overstayed her welcome. I was a mother who was being kept away from her child by a man who had used my life savings to buy his own comfort. I sat in the dark of my suite that night, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of anger. Not just sadness, but a cold, sharp anger. I realized that the reasonable voice Jason used was a weapon. The charm he had displayed on Maple Drive was a tool. He had moved me like a piece on a chessboard, and now he was trying to remove me from the board entirely. I realized I couldn't just wait for things to get better. I couldn't just be nice and hope they would love me again. I was 63 years old, and I was alone in a beautiful house that felt like a prison. I didn't know what was coming next, but I knew that the silence was about to end. I knew that the child's question was the first crack in the dam, and the flood was coming. Christmas Eve has always been my favorite day of the year. I love the anticipation. I love the smell of pine needles and the way the world seems to quiet down for a few hours. That year, I had spent 3 full days baking. I made shortbread cookies, a cranberry pound cake, and the ginger snaps that Cooper, my grandson Noah, had specifically requested because they were his favorite. I wanted this Christmas to be the turning point. I wanted the holiday spirit to heal the rifts that had grown between us. I had wrapped gifts for the children with the kind of care you only learn from decades of being a mother. I had bought Jason a high-quality leather briefcase for when he found his new job. I had bought Sarah a locket with a picture of her father inside. I carried everything through the interior door myself. It took 2 trips. I set the platters of cookies on the kitchen counter, while Sarah was arranging flowers for the table. For a few hours, it felt like the old days. The children opened a few early gifts. We played a card game. Jason's mother, who had driven up from Kentucky, was there, laughing and telling stories. I let myself believe that the shadows were finally lifting. But then dinner ended. The children had gone into the living room, spectre zeft. Spectre zero sefter zero reba das room. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of the television. We were still sitting at the big kitchen table, the same table where I had once imagined years of happy family meals. Jason reached into the pocket of his sweater and pulled out a white envelope. He didn't look at me with warmth. He didn't look at me with gratitude. He used his professional voice, the one he used when he wanted to sound like the most rational person in the room. He slid the envelope across the table toward me. "We've been meaning to talk to you about this, Eleanor," he said. His voice was flat. "With everything going on financially, we've had to take a very hard look at the household expenses. The suite has its own utilities. It has its own wear and tear. It's not really fair to the rest of the family to treat this as a free arrangement indefinitely." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I opened the envelope. Inside was a document titled Rental Agreement. It was a month-to-month tenancy. The amount listed was $1,950 a month. I looked at the number. $1,950. My teacher's pension and Social Security barely covered that. If I paid this, I would have nothing left. I would be completely dependent on them for every scrap of food, every gallon of gas, every basic necessity. I looked up at my daughter. "Sarah," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "am I on the deed to this house?" Sarah didn't look at me. She looked down at her hands, which were folded tightly on the table. She looked like she wanted to disappear. That pause, that long, suffocating silence, was its own kind of answer. "The financing was complicated, Eleanor," Jason interrupted. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes cold and defiant. "Your contribution of $215,000 came in as a gift for down payment purposes. The bank required it. Structuring it any other way would have affected the mortgage terms and the interest rates. We told you this at the closing. Our gift. They were calling my life savings. The equity from the home I had shared with my husband for 34 years. A gift." "I didn't give you a gift, Jason," I said. My voice was suddenly very clear, very steady. "I bought a share of this house. I paid for the suite. We had an agreement. We have a gift letter, Eleanor," Jason said, his voice sharpening. "Signed by you, notarized. In the eyes of the law, that money belongs to this household. And as the homeowners, Sarah and I have decided that a formal rental agreement is the only way to move forward fairly." I looked at the rental agreement again. I saw the words, "occupancy at the discretion of the homeowners." It was a threat. It wasn't an agreement. It was a demand for total submission. If I didn't pay, or if I didn't behave, they could evict me. At 63 years old, I was being told that my $215,000 bought me nothing but the right to be a paying guest in my own home. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I stood up from the table. I looked at Sarah one last time, but she still wouldn't meet my eyes. "I need to see the closing documents," I said. The originals. Tomorrow morning. It's the holidays, Eleanor, Jason said with a dismissive wave of his hand. Let's not make a scene. I didn't respond. I walked through the mudroom. I went into my suite. I closed the door, and I locked it. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the chair by the window, looking out at the dark backyard. I thought about the day I signed those papers. I thought about how much I had wanted to trust them. I thought about the word gift. I realized then that Jason had planned this from the very beginning. He had waited until I had no house to go back to. He had waited until my money was safely in his bank account. He had waited until Christmas Eve, a night when I was at my most vulnerable, to strike. But as the sun began to rise on Christmas morning, I realized something else. Jason thought he had won. He thought I was just an old woman with nowhere to go. He thought my gift was the end of the story. He was wrong. I was a teacher for 31 years. I know how to do my homework. And I knew that while Jason was a property manager, he wasn't a lawyer. And neither was I, but I knew where to find one. The Christmas ambush was meant to destroy me. Instead, it woke me up. I sat there, in the early morning light, and I made a vow. I was going to get my life back. I was going to get my dignity back. And I was going to make sure that Jason learned exactly what happens when you try to steal from a woman who has nothing left to lose. The battle for the house on the hill had just begun. The night of Christmas Eve was the longest night of my life. I didn't turn on the lights in my suite. I just sat in the armchair by the window, watching the snow fall silently over the backyard. I looked at the swing set, now covered in a thin white blanket. The same swing set where I had spent so many happy afternoons with Emma and Noah. Everything looked the same, but everything was different. The house that I had called home for 18 months now felt like a cold, hollow shell. I thought about the rental agreement sitting on my kitchen counter. $1,950. I thought about the word gift. I thought about the way Jason had looked at me, with that smug, untouchable confidence. He thought he had trapped me. He thought that because I was 63 years old and a widow, I would simply fold. He thought I was too afraid of losing my daughter to fight for myself. He was wrong. At 4 o'clock in the morning, I couldn't wait any longer. I picked up my phone and called my son, Michael, in London. Because of the time difference, it was already mid-morning for him. He answered on the second ring. "Mom?" His voice was full of concern. "It's middle of the night there. Is everything okay?" I told him everything. I told him about the envelope. I told him about the $215,000 being called a gift. I told him about the silence and the isolation. I spoke for 20 minutes, and for 20 minutes my son stayed silent. When I finally finished, I heard him take a long, deep breath. "Mom," Michael said, his voice hard and steady, "you need to listen to me. Do not sign anything. Do not argue with Jason. Do not even tell them you called me. You need an attorney, and not some friend of Jason's. You need your own representation, someone who only looks out for Eleanor." That was the moment my resistance began. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a woman with a plan. The day after Christmas, December 26th, I was waiting at the doors of a law office in downtown Cincinnati. I had found a woman named Diane. She had been practicing real estate law in Ohio for 22 years. She was known for being sharp, thorough, and completely unimpressed by men like Jason. I sat in her office, surrounded by walls of leather-bound books and the quiet hum of a professional workplace. I explained the situation. I told her about the sale of Maple Drive. I told her about the wire transfer to the escrow account. "Did you keep any of the correspondence from before the closing, Eleanor?" Diane asked. She was leaning back in her chair, watching me with a focused, analytical gaze. "Any texts? Any emails where the ownership was discussed?" I went home and I dug. I went through my old laptop, which I hadn't used much since the move. I went through every folder, every deleted item. And then I found it. It was an email thread from the week before the closing. I had sent a message to Jason. asking him to confirm that my name would be listed on the deed alongside theirs. I remember how nervous I was when I sent it, afraid of sounding like I didn't trust him. His response was brief. It was only 4 words long. All taken care of. I stared at those 4 words. All taken care of. In that moment, I realized that Jason hadn't just made a mistake. He had made a representation. He had told me, in writing, that my ownership was secured. I took that email to Diane the next morning. She printed it out and laid it on her desk. She also looked at the wire transfer confirmation for the $215,000. "This is significant, Eleanor," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was a spark of victory in her eyes. "Under Ohio law, we can argue for something called a constructive trust, even if your name isn't on the deed. The fact that you contributed such a massive amount of money, and the fact that Jason represented to you that you would be an owner, gives you a claim. He can't just take your life savings and then charge you rent for the privilege of being alive." She explained that Jason had committed what is called unjust enrichment. He had taken my money to benefit himself and his wife, while leaving me with nothing but a bill. "We are going to send a letter," Diane said. "A formal legal demand. We are going to notify them that we are aware of the deed structure, and we are going to assert your ownership interest based on your financial contribution. We are going to tell them that the rental agreement is null and void." I walked out of her office that day feeling 10 feet tall. For months, I had felt small. I had felt like I was disappearing. But as I drove back to the house on the hill, I realized that I wasn't alone. I had the law on my side. I had my son on my side. And most importantly, I had my own voice back. Jason thought he was playing a game of checkers. He didn't realize I was playing chess. And I was about to make my first move. The formal letter from Diane arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in early January. I was in my suite, making a cup of tea, when I heard the heavy thud of the mail hitting the floor in the mudroom. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of the main house door opening. I heard Jason's footsteps. I heard the sound of paper being torn open. And then, the silence ended. I heard Jason's voice. It wasn't the reasonable voice. It wasn't the charming voice. It was a roar of pure, unfiltered rage. He was shouting Sarah's name. I heard them in the kitchen, their voices muffled by the walls, but the tone was unmistakable. Jason was losing control. A few minutes later, there was a violent pounding on my interior door. Not a knock. A pounding. I set my tea down. My heart was racing, but my hands remained very still. I opened the door. Jason was standing there, his face flushed a deep, angry red. He was holding Diane's letter in his hand, shaking it at me. "What is this, Eleanor?" he hissed. He was trying to keep his voice down so the kids wouldn't hear, but his eyes were bulging. "A lawyer? You're bringing a lawyer into this family? After everything we've done for you? After we gave you a place to live?" I stood my ground. I didn't back away. "I didn't bring a lawyer into this family, Jason," I said. My voice was quiet and steady. "You brought a rental agreement to a Christmas dinner. You brought a gift letter to a closing. I am simply protecting what is mine." "You have nothing!" Jason yelled. He stepped into my suite, invading my space. "That money was a gift. You signed the papers. You have no legal standing whatsoever. If you pursue this, if you listen to this woman, you are going to tear this family apart. Do you want Emma and Noah to see their grandmother sue their parents? Is that the legacy you want?" It was a classic move. He was trying to use my love for my grandchildren as a shield for his own greed. He was trying to make me feel guilty for his betrayal. "I want my grandchildren to know that their grandmother is a woman of dignity," I said. "And I want them to know that truth matters. If this family is torn apart, Jason, it won't be because of a lawyer's letter. It will be because of what you did in that title office in September." Jason's face twisted. The mask of the perfect son-in-law was gone. In its place was a man who was desperate and cruel. "You're going to regret this, Eleanor," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "Things are going to get very ugly for you here." very fast. You think you're isolated now? Just wait. He turned and slammed the door so hard that the Lake Erie painting on my wall rattled. An hour later, Sarah came to my door. She had been crying. Her eyes were puffy, and she looked like she had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. She sat down at my small kitchen table and buried her face in her hands. "Mom," she sobbed. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know it was structured this way. I wanted to believe her. I desperately wanted to believe my daughter hadn't betrayed me." "Jason told me that the gift letter was just a formality for the bank," Sarah whispered. "He said that because we were family, the deed didn't matter. He said it was the only way to get the mortgage approved because his credit wasn't perfect after the job loss. He told me you were happy to do it. He told me it was your idea." I felt a wave of cold realization. Jason hadn't just lied to me. He had lied to his wife. He had manipulated both of us, playing us against each other to get exactly what he wanted, a $215,000 windfall that he controlled entirely. "He's so angry, Mom," Sarah said, looking at me with fear in her eyes. "He says we're going to lose the house if you sue us. He says we'll be out on the street with the kids." "We aren't going to lose the house, Sarah," I said, taking her hand. "But I am not going to be a tenant in a home I paid for. I am not going to pay $1,950 a month to a man who lied to my face." That evening, the house was silent. Jason didn't come out of his room. Sarah stayed upstairs with the children. I sat in my suite, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt like a woman who was finally seeing the world for what it really was. The mask had fallen. The sweet proposal was a fraud. The family home was a business transaction for Jason. But the most important thing I realized that night was this. Jason was afraid. He was shouting and threatening because he knew he had been caught. He knew that 4 little words, "all taken care of," were about to cost him everything. The battle lines were drawn. And for the first time, I knew I was going to win. The mediation took place on a grey, drizzly morning in March. I remember the air was just starting to lose its winter bite, but it was still cold enough to make my joints ache as I walked into the law firm downtown. Diane was already there, sitting in a glass-walled conference room that looked out over the Ohio River. She looked calm. She looked prepared. Jason arrived 10 minutes late. He brought an attorney with him, a younger man who spent most of the session looking at his phone and checking his watch. Jason didn't look at me once. He sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, staring at a spot on the wall behind Diane's head. Sarah sat next to him, but she looked like a shadow of herself. She had dark circles under her eyes, and she didn't say a single word for the first hour. Diane did not waste any time. She laid out the facts with the precision of a surgeon. She showed the wire transfer of the $215,000. She showed the email where Jason promised that everything was all taken care of regarding the deed. She explained, in very clear, very cold legal terms, that my contribution entitled me to an ownership interest, regardless of what the gift letter said. Jason's attorney tried to argue. He called the money a voluntary gift. He said I was trying to back out of a family agreement because I was unhappy. But Diane didn't blink. She leaned forward and lowered her voice, a sign that things were about to get very serious. "We aren't just here to talk about the house, Jason," Diane said. She slid a second folder across the table. I didn't know what was in it, but Jason's face went pale the moment he saw the letterhead. It was a report from a financial forensics expert Diane had hired. It turned out that Jason hadn't lost his job because of downsizing. He had been terminated for cause. Specifically, he had been caught mishandling client escrow accounts at his property management firm. He had been moving money around to cover his own personal debts. And it got worse. Diane had found out that Jason had secretly taken out a second mortgage on a property he owned solely in his own name, and he had used cash advances to hide the truth from Sarah for over a year. The room went completely silent. I looked at my daughter. Sarah was staring at Jason with a look of pure, horrified realization. She hadn't known about the embezzlement. She hadn't known about the second mortgage. She had been living in a house of cards, and Jason was the one who had built it. "Here is our offer," Diane said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "We are not going to force a sale of the house today, because we don't want to displace Sarah and the children. However, we are filing a legally recorded lien against this property in the amount of $215,000. This lien must be satisfied in full upon any future sale, any refinancing, or any transfer of the property. Eleanor's money will be the first money out," she continued. "Furthermore, we require a formal notarized document acknowledging Eleanor's right to occupy the suite for as long as she chooses, at no cost. Any change to this arrangement will require 60 days of written notice and a court order." Jason's attorney whispered something in his ear. Jason looked like he was about to explode, but he had no moves left. The forensic report was enough to trigger a criminal investigation if we chose to pursue it. He knew he was beaten. He picked up the pen and signed the documents. As we walked out of the office, the rain had stopped. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. My money was protected. My home was secured. I had a lien for $215,000 recorded at the county office. It wasn't just a number on a piece of paper. It was my life's work, returned to me. But the victory was bittersweet. 3 months later, in June, Sarah and Jason separated. The truth about the money and the lies had finally broken the marriage beyond repair. Jason moved out in the middle of the night, leaving behind a trail of debt and broken promises. Sarah is still in the main house. She is working 2 jobs now to keep up with the mortgage, and I am helping her where I can. We are careful with each other now. We are more deliberate, more honest. We don't let things go unspoken anymore because we've learned how much damage silence can do. Some mornings, at 7:30, I hear a soft knock on my door. It's Noah. He asks if we can make those silver dollar pancakes. And we do. We sit in my small kitchen, the one I paid for, and we talk about his school and his friends. I think about Maple Drive sometimes. I think about my rose bushes and my neighbor, Martha. I still miss that house. But then I look at my grandson's face, and I realize that while I lost my old life, I saved my family. I got justice. I got my dignity back. But most importantly, I learned that you can love people with all your heart, but you must always keep your paperwork in order. The truth was bitter, but the peace I feel now, sitting on my patio as the sun goes down over Cincinnati, that peace is real, and it is mine. I sit here now, on a warm Thursday evening, and the world feels very different than it did on that cold Christmas Eve. Sarah and I are sitting on the back porch. The sun has just dipped below the horizon, and the first few fireflies are beginning to blink in the tall grass of the backyard. Sarah reached over a few minutes ago and poured us each a glass of wine. She didn't say anything. She just rested her hand on mine for a moment, and in that silence, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. We are rebuilding. It is not the same as it was before. It is more deliberate now. We are more honest with each other, even when the honesty feels uncomfortable. Jason is gone, and while his absence left a hole in the family's finances, it also took the tension and the lies with him. The house feels lighter. It feels like a home again. But I still think about Maple Drive. I think about my rose bushes, and I wonder if the new owners are taking care of them, or if they've been replaced by something else. I think about how much I wanted to trust the people I loved, and how that very desire was used as a tool against me. If there is one thing I would say to anyone listening, anyone who is where I was, 60-something, widowed, or perhaps just feeling a bit lonely, if you are being offered a lovely arrangement by people who love you, please, get your own attorney. Not their attorney. Not a friend of the family. Yours. Have someone who works only for you read every single line before you touch a pen to paper. It is not a sign of distrust. It is a sign that you have worked your entire life for what you have, and you deserve to protect it. You are not being difficult. You are being smart. I raised my daughter to be a good person, but I forgot to teach her that even good people can be misled by a charming voice. We both learned that lesson the hard way. $215,000 is a lot of money, but the lesson was worth even more. Some things in this life do not need words, like the way my grandson Noah looks at me when I flip a pancake, or the way the fireflies glow in the dark. But the paperwork always needs words. Please, do not forget that. If this story resonated with you, or if you think it could help someone you know, please give this video a like. And if you would like to hear more stories about life, lessons, and finding justice, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us share these messages with those who need them most. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of yourselves, and take care of each other.